It was nearly 11 p.m. as we bumped along the desert. Ahmed was driving the van. He usually does, one hand on the wheel, the other holding a cigarette between his fingers. Mahmoud rests his AK-47 casually against his shoulder, the butt of it on the floor between him and Ahmed. His hand rests comfortably near the trigger, a lazy sort of relaxation between him and his weapon. He was constantly changing the radio dial. He likes Ethiopian music. None of the rest of us did. Ahmed likes to push the Jeep to 120 kilometers per hour. The road is a hodgepodge of dirt, gravel, and huge potholes. We brake and swerve and accelerate without any hesitation. I grip the handle above my head, but I like the way my stomach dips and dives with the van. There are 4 students behind me in the back. 4 boys that are talking animatedly about something that interests only them. One of them, Abdikani, is louder than the rest. There are 3 girls next to me. One of them has fallen asleep against my shoulder, and the other 2 are sharing a pair of headphones. I'm tired, but in that way you're grateful for. Somaliland gained its independence from Somalia in 1960. Since then, it has operated as its own country. It has its own government, currency, borders, military. It has its own national language, Somali, its own religion, Muslim, its own national anthem, Sumukuwar, which means long life with peace. This all becomes more important once you realize that according to the UN, Somaliland is not recognized as an independent nation. Its citizens are not afforded the same rights. In fact, if you're a Somalilander, to the rest of the world, you don't exist. But there are nearly 4 million Somalilanders, and in 2016, I found myself living in a compound in the middle of the desert, 2 hours outside of Hargeisa, the capital city, with 10 other teachers and about 200 students. One of the major programs I was the faculty advisor of was the orphanage program, where 7 of our students, ages 14 to 17, and 1 teacher, me, got to travel to Hargeisa once a week to teach math and English to the students who lived there. This was why we were in a van at 11 p.m. at night in the middle of the desert. We had already gone through 3 checkpoints from Hargeisa, and we were waiting on the 4th and final checkpoint before we were home. We could hear the shouts in the distance before we could even see the outline of the checkpoint. As a large gateway came into view, we heard the rapid fire of gunshots, and Ahmed slammed on the brakes. All of us lurched forward, except Mahmoud, who already had his AK-47 pointed out of the passenger side window. We were silent. The 4 boys in the back leaned forward to see out of the window clearer, and the 2 girls over here pulled out their headbuds to hear. The girl next to me that had just been asleep was now awake, and she wrapped her own fingers around my own. It was so quiet in the van. So quiet that we could hear every gunshot as another checkpoint guard was hit. We watched as the men in uniforms but without insignia pulled people from the vehicles in front of us, pushing them to the ground, men, women, and children. I turned around in my seat, and I told the boys to sink as low to the floor as they could, while I guided the girls next to me down as well. Ahmed looked at me then. He looked at Mahmoud, and both men exited the vehicle. Mahmoud leveled his gun at the men in the distance while Ahmed pulled his from underneath the driver's seat. Al-Shabaab in English means the youth. But in Somaliland and the other neighboring countries in the Horn of Africa, it means the largest and most cunning terrorist organization in their region. Most of my students have had parents, siblings, and other family members die in Al-Shabaab-led attacks. A number of the older students have often faced the gunfire of these attacks themselves. For most of them, they have often been plagued for their entire life with the threat of terrorism. The men who were soldiers, but not really soldiers, noticed our van and noticed the two Somalilanders that were now pointing their own weapons. They opened fire on our van, and Ahmed and Mahamud crouched down to the ground. Ahmed opened the side of the van door and looked at me. He asked me if I knew how to drive. I nodded once, and he passed me the keys. He then told me that I needed to drive in the opposite direction. I started to shake my head, but he was already gone. I turned and looked at the students around me, and that's when I moved from the middle seat to the driver's seat. But before I got there, Mona, who had just been holding my hand, pointed at my hip on my side and was like, "Miss Megan, you're bleeding." I looked down and saw the dark pinpoint of blood at my side seeping through my dira. I dropped my hand and put it there and wondered when I had even gotten hurt. But as I felt the warm blood there and the little ridge in my side, I knew I had gotten grazed by something. Another round of gunshots alerted us. Uba, one of the older students, moved forward, and she took the only thing that she could find to put pressure on the wound, my dira, my scarf. I have never felt more exposed in my life than without my hijab, which is strange considering that until that year I had never worn one before. She wrapped it around my waist and cinched it at the side. Another round of gunshots alerted me that I needed to get moving, so I climbed to the driver's seat fully and I put us into reverse. But the tires wouldn't grab purchase on the dusty rocks. Abdikhani from the back shouted that I needed to move forward and then move back. I took his advice, and I slammed us into drive, shot forward, and then reversed us as quick as I could. As soon as I had enough distance between us and the checkpoint, I put us back into drive, turned us 180 degrees, and shot into the desert. And that's the last thing I remember. I can remember driving towards the moon as my students started to sit up in their seats again. I can remember looking in the rearview mirror and seeing their faces looking back at me. And I knew what they were thinking, that this was normal, that their entire lives up until this point had been nothing but this. When I woke up later, I was greeted with Abdikhani and Uba, who told me that I had passed out and someone had taken over driving. I asked about Ahmed and Mahamud, and they were okay, and so were the other students. Everyone was fine. Everything had resumed its routine. And I wondered again what sort of lives these children must lead if this was as routine as waking up, if this was as routine as brushing their teeth, if this was as routine as breathing. I think about my survival that night a lot. I think about how close I was to never coming home and how crazy it was that had never even happened in the first place, and then I hate myself a little for it. Because I've always had the luxury to be surprised. I've always had the privilege of safety. So instead, I think about their survival. I think about Ahmed and Mahamud. I think about Uba and Abdikhani. I think about Saeed and Mona and Marwan and Muhammad and Hani. And all the other students at Abarso and all the other vibrant, youthful people in Somaliland that are just going from one checkpoint to the next, their lives often broken up by invisibility and gunfire. And that's when I know that they do more than survive. They live, so that one day they can be proud to say they are from Somaliland. And the rest of the world will have to listen.